Good day, everyone. I am Mary Joy Almasin. Today, I am going to discuss the Chapter 3 of the Sociolinguistic, Language Maintenance and Shift. We were going to discuss also the language shift in different communities, language loss and death, factors contributing to language shift, how can minority language be maintained, and lastly, the language revival. So let us all read the definition of language shift. Language shift is language transfer or language replacement whereby a speech community of a language shift to speaking another language. It happens with the language of the wider society, majority, displaces the minority mother tongue language over time in migrant communities. Therefore, when language shift occurs, it shifts most of the time towards the language of the dominant group, and the result could be the eradication of the local language. According to Winford 2003, page 15, language shift refers to the partial or total abandonment of a group's native language in favor of another. Further also to Huffman in 1896, language shift is always preceded by multilingualism. If we say multilingualism is the ability of an individual speaker or a community of speakers to communicate effectively in 3 or more languages. Again, multilingualism. Multilingualism is the ability of an individual speaker or a community of speakers to communicate effectively in 3 or more languages. Huffman 1991 stated, when a community does not maintain its language but gradually adopts another one, we talked about language shift. Let's proceed to the language shift in different communities. The first one is migrant minorities. Second one is the non-migrant communities. And the third one is the migrant majorities. So in these 3 communities, we will be able to tackle on how does the language shift in these different communities. Now let's discuss first the migrant minorities. Migrant minorities refer to a group of people who have moved from their homeland to another country or region where they are a minority group. These communities often face pressure to shift from the native language to the dominant language of the new location. Now let us all read the example number 1. Maniben is a young British Hindu woman who lives in the Coventry. Her family moved to Britain from Uganda in 1970. When she was 5 years old, she started work on the shop floor in a bicycle factory when she was 16. At home, Maniben speaks Gujarati with her parents and grandparents. Although she had learned English at school, she found she didn't need much at work. Many of the girls working with her also spoke Gujarati, so when it wasn't too noisy, they would talk to each other in their home language, which is the Gujarati. So Maniben was good at her job and she got promoted to floor supervisor. In that job, she needed to use English more of the time, though she could still use some Gujarati with her old workmates. She went to evening class and learned to type. Then, because she was interested, she went on to learn how to use a computer. Now she works in the maintain office and she uses English almost all the time at work. So in this example, Maniben's pattern of language used at work has gradually shifted over a period of 10 years. At one stage, she used mainly Gujarati. Now, she uses English almost exclusively. And example 1 also shows that migrant family provides example of language shift. The example illustrates how a British Hindu woman living in Britain tended to use Gujarati at home as well as her workplace with her friend as their home language. However, when Manibin was promoted, so in that situation shows that she has moved to a high level which forces her to use an high variety, which is the English. She used English more of the time. Finally, when she was moved to the main office, she used English all the time. This example shows the experience of a minority in a monolingual country and how the predominant society's language over time displaced the mother tongue of the minority. This shift was made by social factors as the shift occurs from one language to another for communicative needs. A language shift in migrant minorities occurs when a minority group that has moved to a new country or region begins to adopt the dominant language of the host country, often at the expense of their original language. This process typically happens over several generations and is influenced by various social, economic, and social culture. Let us all read here the important key concept of migrant minorities. Migrant minorities, the order of domain in which language shift occurs, may differ from different individuals and different groups. But gradually, over time, the language of the wider society displaces their minority language, mother tongue. So that is according to the book of Janet Holmes, 2013, page 53. So the next slide. There are many different social factors which can lead a community to shift from using one language for most purposes to using a different language, or from using two distinct codes in different domains to using different varieties of just one language for their communicative needs. Migrant families provides an obvious example of the process of language shift. So that is according also to Janet Holmes, 2013, page 53 to 54. Immigrants who look and sound different are often regarded as threatening by majority group members. There is a pressure to conform in all kinds of ways. So that is also according to Janet Holmes' book, 2013. Typically, migrants are virtually monolingual. If we say monolingual, they can only speak in one language. Typically, migrants are virtually monolingual in their mother tongue. Their children are bilingual. If so bilingual, those individuals or community speaker who can speak two language, and their grandchildren are often monolingual in language of the host country. So that's all in our migrant minorities. So let's proceed to the non-migrant communities. So non-migrant communities are indigenous or native groups who have not moved but may still experience to shift their language due to the influence of a dominant external language. This situation often arises when a politically or economically dominant group imposes its language on the local population. In that example, in 1920s, Oberwart was a small place and the peasant used Hungarian to each other and German with outsiders. As Oberwart grew and industry replaced farming as the main source of jobs, the function of German expanded. German became the high language in a broad of diglossia in Oberwart. German was the language of school, official transactions, and economic advancement. It expressed formality and social distance. Hungarian was the low language used in most homes and for friendly interaction between the townspeople. Hungarian was the language of solidarity used for social and affective functions. The idea to get on meant learning German, and a knowledge of German is equivalent with social and economic progress. Speaking Hungarian was increasingly associated with peasantness. Speaking Hungarian was increasingly associated with peasantness and old-fashioned. Old-fashioned when you speak Hungarian. Ang high language, their high language is the German, and their low language is the Hungarian. So, young people begin to use German to socialize, and parents' communication in German instead of Hungarian to their children. So let us all read some important concepts. In Janet Holmes' book, 2013, political, economic, and social changes can occur within a community, and this may result in linguistic changes too. So that is according to Janet Holmes, 2013, page 55. In general, the domain in which a minority language is used, the more likely it will be maintained. Domain compartmentalization, keeping the domains of use of the two languages quite separate. Also, assist resistant to infiltration from the dominant language, where minority language have resisted shift longest. There has been at least one domain in which minority language is used exclusively. The home is the most under any family's control, and especially where there are grandparents and older family members who use the language. Language maintenance has been possible. In larger minority communities, the minority language be maintained in more domain than just home. Religious services may be held in the minority group language. Some education, example out of school classes, may take place in the language. There may even be some work available which allow the use of minority language. So that's are some important concept in non-migrant communities. Now let us all read the definition of migrant majorities. So we are now in the third communities. Migrant majorities are groups that have migrated and now form the dominant or majority population in a new location. In these cases, the language of the migrant group often becomes the dominant language of the region, sometimes leading to the marginalization or decline of the language spoken by the original inhabitants. So here's an example. Tamati lives in the Wanganui, a large New Zealand town. He is 10 years old, and he speaks and understands only English language, though he knows a few Maori phrases. None of his mates know any Maori either. His grandfather speaks Maori, however. Whenever there is a big gathering, such as funeral or an important tribal meeting, his grandfather is one of the best speakers. Tamati's mother and father understand Maori, but they are not fluent speakers. They can manage a short, simple conversation, but that's about it. Tamati's little sister, Mariama, has just started at preschool where Maori is used, so Tamati thinks maybe he'll learn a bit from her. So let us all read. When colonial powers invade other countries, their language often becomes dominant. It was not possible for a single alien and imported language to displace and eradicate hundreds of indigenous vernacular language. But when multilingualism was not widespread in an area, or where just one indigenous language had been used before the colonizers arrived, language were often under threat. So that is according to the book of Janet Holmes, 2013. So that was the third communities, the migrant communities. So first, language shift in different communities. First is the migrant minorities. The language shift occurs in a gradual process. The language shift in the communities, pressure from the wider society, and the daily interaction in specific domains. So that is the migrant minorities. Again, migrant minorities, the language shift occurs in a gradual process. Migrant minorities, pressure from the wider society, and daily interaction in specific domain. The second one is the non-migrant communities. So in non-migrant communities, the language shift occurs, or the language shift in that communities is political, economic, and social changes. The third one is the migrant majorities. Colonial powers invade other countries. So that's all in the language shift in different communities. So language loss and death. So here's an example of language loss. Let us all read. Annie at 20 is a young speaker of Jerbal, an Australian Aboriginal language. She also speaks English, in which she learned at school. There is no written Jerbal material for her to read, and there are fewer and fewer contexts in which she can appropriately hear and speak the language. So she steadily become less proficient in it. Less proficient in Jerbal. She can understand the Jerbal she hears used by older people in her community, and she uses it to speak to her grandmother. But her grandmother is scoffing about her ability in Jerbal, saying Annie doesn't speak the language properly. So Annie there is experiencing language loss. This is the manifestation in the individual experience of wide-scale language death. So in that example, language loss because Annie uses English for most purposes. Her vocabulary in Jerbal has shrunk and shrunk. Language loss since English is now so widely used in her community. It seems unlikely Jerbal will survive. When Annie's generation die, it is pretty certain that Jerbal will die with them. The process of language death for the language comes about through this kind of gradual loss of fluency and competency by its speakers. So language death. When all people who speak a language die, the language dies with them. Example, monks has now completely died out in the Isle of Man, the last native speaker. Ned Madrill died in 1974. Again, when all people who spoke a language die, the language dies with them. Also, this is case of language death rather than language shift. These languages are no longer spoken anymore. So that is a language death. The next slide, factors contributing to language shift. What are the factors contributing to language shift? So the reasons are often economic, social, and political. There are also factors contributing to language shift, such as demographic factors, attitude, and values. In the economic factor, language shift often reflects the influence of economic factors, such as the need for work. People may shift both location and language for this reason. Next is the social factor. There is pressure from the wider society. Immigrants who look and sound different are often regarded as a threatening major group member. There is a pressure to conform in all kinds of ways. For instance, in a small language, community language, of course, when the community sees no reason to take active steps to maintain their ethnic language. When a community of speakers moving to a region whose language is different, there is a tendency to shift the new language. Next is the political factor. A rapid shift occurs when people are anxious to get on a society or to get on in a society where knowledge of the second language is a prerequisite for success. Also, political factor imposes on a language shift. In a multilingual country, the authority usually chooses one language as the lingua franca to unify various kinds of ethnic. The number of ethnic language speakers decreases. The next one is the demographic factor. Demographic factor plays the role in the process of language shift. When there is a community speaker moving to a region or a country whose language is different from theirs, there is a tendency to shift to the new language. Next is attitude and values. Language shift tends to be slower among communities where the minority language is highly valued. When the minority groups support the use of minority language, it helps them resist the pressure from the majority group to switch language. To sum up, language shift is an interesting and inevitable linguistic phenomenon. The factors which trigger the shift vary from one language to another. Some of them are demographic, attitude, and values, economic, social, and political factors. Language maintenance. So let's define language maintenance. Language maintenance is the degree to which an individual or group continues to use their language. particularly in bilingual or multilingual area or among immigrant group, whereas language shift is a process by which a new language is acquired by new community, usually resulting with the loss of the community's first language. So, how can be a minority language be maintained? How can a minority language be maintained? First, a language can be maintained and preserved when it's highly valued as an important symbol of ethnic group. Number two, if families from a minority group live near each other and see each other frequently, their interaction will help to maintain the language. 3. For immigrant individuals from a minority group, the degree and frequency of contact with the homeland can contribute to language shift. Next, intermarriage within the same minority group is helpful to maintain the native language. Next, ensuring that the minority group language is used at formal settings such as schools or worship places will increase language maintenance. An extended normal family in which parents, children, and grandchildren live together and use the same minority language can help to maintain it. Lastly, institutional support from domains such as education, law, administration, religion, and the media can make a difference between the success and failure of maintaining a minority group. So, that's the idea on how can minority language be maintained. Let's proceed to the last slide. Language revival. So language revival, when people try to make a language that is not spoken or is spoken very little, or is spoken very little, spoken more often again. Hebrew language was revived in Israel after being effectively dead for nearly 1,700 years. In language revival, sometimes a community becomes aware that its language is in danger of disappearing and takes deliberate steps to revitalize it. It's sometimes argued that the success of such efforts will depend on how far language loss has occurred. That there is a point of no return, but it seems very likely that more important are attitudinal factors, such as how strongly people want to revive the language and the reason for doing so. So that is language revival. So that's my report in chapter 3, language maintenance and shift. First, we discussed the language shift in different communities. So there are 3 communities: the migrant minorities, the non-migrant communities, the migrant majorities. Also, we discussed the language death and loss. We also discussed the different factors contributing to language shift. They are the social, economic, political, demographic, attitude, and values. So we all know that language shift generally refers to the process by which one language displaces another in the linguistic repertoire of a community. And also, we discuss on how does the language, or how can we maintain a minority language. There are many ways on maintaining a language. A language also can be maintained when it is highly valued as an important symbol of ethnic identity for the minority group. Also, we discuss also the language revival. You all know that language revival is, we all know that sometimes communities are aware that the language is in danger of disappearing. So they take steps in revitalizing reviving or revitalizes the language. Also, language death has occurred when a language is no longer spoken naturally anywhere in the world. So that could be all. Thank you.